Hashem. Okay. All right.
Safer for you if they're down here.
Okay, let's go. So we're on Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. We're going to be learning tonight a very interesting topic. Some of you might be familiar with the topic, and that is the topic of David and Bathsheba. I don't know if you remember a little bit of the story of David and Bathsheba. It's one of those stories that when you first learn it, it sort of sticks in your minds.
Yes, it does.
So we're going to be learning a little bit about the story of David and Bathsheba tonight, and we'll see how that's...
Texting now.
What?
They text across the whole town.
Right.
Sexting.
How that story connects to the Gemara that we're learning tonight. Okay. So we are Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph. We're 21a4, and we are let's see,
3. I thought.
A3, yeah, we're on 3 still.
21. Are we 21a3? Well, we sort of finished last week the very end of 21a3. Right? We went through the different opinions as to how do at what point do we know. That we can rest assured that a person is not going to transgress. And that was the 3 opinions of a Tamir Chacham v'Yom HaMisa, Tamir Chacham v'Yiraschei, and then finally, Tamir Chacham shesalka le'shemata liba dehilchas. Those were the different opinions that we had. Okay, so now the Gemara is going to continue by making reference. That's Daisy, everybody, that's Daisy. Right?
Daisy, come here. Come on.
Right, so the Gemara is going to continue. Norman, good to see you. The Gemara is going to continue talking about making reference to something that we learned a little bit earlier. We learned a little bit earlier in the Brisa. At the top of the page, the following said the Brisa, Davar Acher, another interpretation, Aveira mechabe mitzvah, Ve'ein Aveira mechabe Torah. That when a person does an Aveira, Michael, how are you? When a person does an Aveira, so it is able to extinguish, right? Aveira mechabe mitzvah. It's able to extinguish the benefit of having done a mitzvah. Whereas if I do a mitzvah, so I get a certain credit, that credit gets extinguished when I do an Aveira. However, if I learn Torah, the credit that I get for learning Torah doesn't get extinguished when I do an Aveira. That was part of the Brisa that we learned above in the comparison between mitzvos and Torah, ner and or. Okay, Mark, go ahead.
A quick question. It says mechabe, which is talking about a ner or an or. The choice of the words mechabe as opposed to mevatel. Like, does it cancel out or does it extinguish? And is there a difference in the wording?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think the term mechabe is used because it connects more to the concept of a ner. So I think that's why the terminology is used. The question is, does it cancel out? I mean, I guess up until, well, we'll see from the story. We'll see interestingly how. Maybe the merit of what you've done
is not equal to.
Correct. We'll see.
Right.
Let's see what the Gemara refers
we were
to.
always rewarded for what we did and punished for what we did. That we couldn't do something to make up for an Avera. An Avera couldn't take away the reward that we get. Maybe that we get the reward in this world and then the next, so it'll be less.
No, so our Gemara is saying just the opposite.
That's
in other words,
correct.
right? Our Gemara is saying that that if you do a mitzvah, so clearly there are certain benefits that come to you for a mitzvah, but those benefits from doing a mitzvah can be compromised by doing an Aveira, as opposed to the benefits of Torah, learning Torah, that those can't be compromised by doing an Aveira. So that's what again, it's a brisa, right? It's not every opinion follows it, but it's a brisa, and it's what the brisa is suggesting. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef said, Darshe Rabbi Menachem Bar Yossi Lahai Kra Ki Sinai. That Rabbi Menachem Bar Yossi learned this pasuk. He darshaned it, ki Sinai, as if he had heard it at Sinai. Interestingly, what does it mean as if he had heard it at Sinai? With the same importance. He darshaned it with that same, he gave it the same significance as if he had heard it at Sinai. And V'ilema darshuha doeg v'achitofel hachi, and if Doeg and Achitofel had interpreted it the same way, if they had interpreted this idea of that an Avera can be mechabe the mitzvah, but an Avera can't, the schar that comes from a mitzvah, but it can't be mechabe the schar that comes from learning Torah. So Imale darshuha Doeg v'Achitofel hachi lo radfu basar David. What would have happened? They never would have pursued David HaMelech. So what does it mean they never would have pursued David HaMelech? Right? This idea that they never would have pursued David HaMelech. So first of all, the Gemara, the notes point out that we're really talking about here is Achitophel. We're really not talking about Doeg, we're really talking about Achitophel. But that Achitophel would not have pursued David HaMelech, meaning would not have seen David HaMelech as in a position of weakness. But Achitophel indeed, think about it, why would Achitophel have rebelled against David HaMelech? Because he saw David HaMelech in a position of weakness. And why did he see David HaMelech in a position of weakness? Because the Gemara says he didn't interpret properly this idea that an Aveira can be mechabe a mitzvah, but an Aveira cannot be mechabe Torah. An Aveira cannot be mechabe the schar of Torah. Relate this to David HaMelech. Tell me, what does this have to do with David HaMelech? So the Gemara is making a reference to a story that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, at least in the broader perspective, and that is the Aveira of David, the maybe Aveira of David and Bathsheba. Okay, now, if you look at the Psukim, if you follow the Psukim in Shmuel Beis, it's in Perek Yud Aleph, if you follow the Psukim in Shmuel Beis, and you look at the Pshat does indeed seem to indicate that David HaMelech did something very wrong. Right? That is the Pshat. What's the story? Anybody know the story? What's the story?
He wanted a Bathsheba, so he sent the husband.
Well, first of all, how did he know about Bathsheba?
He's up on his roof, and she's bathing on her roof.
And he was watching.
And he watches her, and then he sends her husband off to war with the knowledge that it's extraordinarily likely that he's going to die.
Okay,
And then
so
she'll be
right,
available.
so that's a great
No.
summary, but wait till we fill in the details. Wait till we fill in the
I just
details.
learned a new one
Right.
tonight. That if I learn Torah tonight, doesn't matter what I do tomorrow. Isn't that what you're saying?
If you're David
If I
HaMelech,
learn Torah,
right?
no,
If you're
if I
David
learn Torah,
HaMelech,
my
right?
affair is tomorrow.
That's
Don't wipe it out.
why we're learning tonight, right? So what do you
I
have?
learn every week.
Right. So you have the following. So listen to what it says in Tanakh. David HaMelech was up on his roof. All right.
Learning Torah.
Now, obviously, Bathsheba. By the way, Bathsheba, just in a twist of fate. Obviously, there's no such thing as a twist of fate, but Bathsheba was the granddaughter of Achitophel. Okay, so not out of the blue. She was the granddaughter of Achitophel. So this woman Bathsheba, does it make sense that Bathsheba is bathing on the roof in full view of anybody else who's up on the roof? Right? It's a
On the roof, that's where they collected water.
Yeah, but she totally knows her
If she's a kid,
proximity
she
to
could.
Well, maybe in the castle or whatever.
If Mike Honig said if she's a kid she could, right? If she's a kid she could. Which Mike, why do you think she might be a kid, Mike?
Because there's a tradition that says that she was underage.
But there is a
At the time.
tradition. There is a tradition that says that she was very young at the time. right? Actually, a tradition that says that she was like 6 years old at the time, which makes it which makes it right, which makes it very hard, makes it very hard, right? Makes it very hard to understand. But okay, we'll come back to this. But
But isn't there a tradition also that Rivka was 3?
yeah, correct, Ein Achinami, right? Ein Achinami. Now, exactly, are these meant that she was really 3 and she was really 6, or what are they teaching us other things? Be that as it may, David HaMelech was up on the roof, and Bathsheba was up on the roof.
I thought it was at night though.
But Bathsheba was up on the roof,
Moonlight.
right? And what was Bathsheba doing up on the roof? So we know she was bathing on the roof, right? So was she bathing on the roof? Well, Ron actually said something very interesting, right? What's up on the roof? The roof is where they collect
Water.
rainwater.
Yeah.
What do you need rainwater for?
Mikveh.
You need rainwater for a mikveh. So according to this interpretation, Bathsheba was going to the mikveh. She was finishing her period of nida. I can't make I can't make everything work. Right? I can't make everything fit together. Right? She was finishing her period of nida. She was going to the mikveh. And it also doesn't make sense that Bathsheba would be going to the mikveh, unclothed, out in the open. And in fact, they say, the Mefarshim explain, that she wasn't out in the open. David HaMelech didn't just look over and see her out in the open, but rather there was a screen that was set up around her, around the mikveh, to ensure that there was certain degree of privacy. What happened?
The wind blew it over, right?
Not
No,
that,
I thought his
right?
roof was much
It's
higher.
not that the wind blew it or that his roof was much higher. The Medrash says that Satan took the form of an animal, and David HaMelech saw this animal, and in an effort to hunt the animal, shot
An arrow.
an arrow. The arrow, obviously there was no animal there, right? The arrow shattered the screen, and David HaMelech saw Bathsheba there, right? David HaMelech saw Bathsheba. Obviously, she caught his eye. He sent for her, and again, we have to come back to that, because what does it mean? The Satan, why was the Satan involved with this? I mean, you could say the Satan's involved in everything, but why was the Satan involved with this? A beautiful thought that David HaMelech actually said to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, listen, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I want to be included in the Shemona Esrei. When they say, Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu Elokei Avraham Elokei Yitzchak v'Elokei Yaakov, I want them to say Elokei David. So Kadosh Baruch Hu said to David, listen, all of the Avos, they face these tremendous challenges in life, and they pass these challenges, and that's why they're there. David HaMelech said, give me a challenge. Right? Give me a challenge. Who else, by the way, said, give me a challenge, and almost didn't make it? Yosef HaTzadik. Yosef HaTzadik, he also said, give me a challenge, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu sent him a challenge, and that was Eshes Potiphar. He almost didn't make it out of that. Okay, so David HaMelech said, give me a challenge, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him the challenge of Bathsheba, which he did not pass. Gave him the challenge of Bathsheba, okay? So he sees this beautiful woman, whether she's 6, whether she's 16, whether she's 26, I don't know, sees this beautiful woman and sends his guards to bring her to him. They bring her to him, he asks who she is, what's the story, and winds up engaging in sexual relationships with her, at least according to the Mefarshim, against her will. This was not something that she agreed to. Why? Because she was married. To whom was she married?
Uriah.
To Uriah HaChiti.
Right.
She was married to Uriah HaChiti. Right? So obviously, she was not interested in the king's advances, but the king was the king, and he had his way with her, and indeed she conceived. Right? She conceived, and she became pregnant. and she let David know subsequently that she was pregnant. So David had an idea. What was David's idea?
Send them to the
Kill the husband.
Well,
No,
first of
before
all, bring
that,
him home
before
so
that.
he can have a night with her.
Right.
So
Ah,
that
right.
She'll
Right.
it'll explain
Right. So
and
what?
get
So
this.
so let's get him furloughed. Let's bring him home and send him home with her. He'll have a night with her, and then I'll be able to say, this
Not
child
mine,
is
it's his.
not mine. Not that anybody would say
No,
it was
but
his.
it's his,
He would
exactly.
say everybody would say, this child is because Uriah came home one night, and that's where the child is from. And what happened? So Uriah was furloughed, came home, came to David. David said, "Go home to your wife." And what happened? And Uriah refused.
Right.
Refused to go home. Right? He said, "How can I go home? How can I be with my wife? They're in the middle of a battle. People are dying. How can I go home?" And the next night, David HaMelech tried the same thing. Tried to get him drunk, and again Uriah refused to go home. So at this point, David HaMelech realized that his plan was not working. So what he did is he sent. What?
So he decides to
Yeah,
kill him.
He sends Uriah back, and he sends Yoav instructions, and Yoav is the Sar Tzava, right? He's the chief of staff. He sends Yoav instructions, and what does he say to Yoav? He says, "Listen, put him in the front, and when there's a battle, have all the other soldiers withdraw,
Right, leave him alone.
right? And have him, hang him out to dry, basically." And that's precisely what happened, and Uriah was killed. Okay, and Bathsheba had a son, right? And when Uriah was killed, David HaMelech marries Bathsheba. Bathsheba has a son. What happens to the son?
After
Son dies. The son dies.
within
Right.
days and so he owns it, Shiva.
And right, a
The
whole
son
thing.
died like a child,
The
child.
son
Oh,
died.
it's still
I don't know exactly what age the son died. Young, very young,
Yeah.
right? And then ultimately they had another son, and that son was Shlomo HaMelech. That son was Shlomo HaMelech. Now the part of the story that's missing is Nasan HaNavi. Who is Nasan HaNavi? He was obviously the Navi at the time. And he comes to reproach David HaMelech for what he did. And he does it in this interesting kind of way. He says, "I want to tell you a story." What's the story? The story is of a fellow who had one sheep.
Faithful.
And there was a very rich guy who had a whole flock. And the rich guy connived the way to take the one sheep from this poor guy. And what should the punishment be? And David HaMelech said, should be killed, right? And Nasan HaNavi said,
You.
that's you, right? You took, okay. So that's the story. That's the story.
There was an other midrash that when Uri was in
Right.
battle,
Yeah.
that they were divorced with Bathsheba.
Okay. So here's where the beauty of the depth of Judaism kicks in, right? Because clearly on a shot
Superficial
level,
is-
on a superficial level, this is pretty bad. This is pretty bad. What happened on a superficial level? He rapes a woman and
kills the husband.
then kills the husband to cover it up.
Right.
And he's David HaMelech? All right, Ein Achinami, he does tshuva.
That's why he's not in the Shemona Esrei.
Right. He does
And I would be there.
I'll never take it either.
right. He does tshuva, but still, even though he does tshuva, nevertheless, what David HaMelech did was a terrible thing.
Right.
So that's pshat, and by and large, most mefarshim reject that pshat. They say that it's not possible that this could have happened on such a simplistic level. And now we start to get in. I mean, there are those who say that there's no question that David HaMelech sinned. The Abarbanel is the primary commentary among them. The Abarbanel is the one who says that you can't take away the simple meaning of the words. No matter how you try to explain this, you can't take away the simple meaning of the words. And David HaMelech did indeed sin. And in fact, our Gemara sort of supports that, because what is our Gemara saying? Our Gemara is saying, yeah, David sinned, but what?
But he learned Torah before.
But because he learned Torah beforehand, he wasn't hung out to dry.
Right.
And as a result of that, he ultimately was victorious over his enemies. His enemies thought that he was finished, and ultimately he was victorious over his enemies. But never, and that's the position of the Abarbanel, is that indeed he did sin. But the Gemara Maseches Brachos says, whoever says that David HaMelech sinned, Eino Ela Toeh. That person is just mistaken. He's off base. So what does the Gemara do to try to understand how we can possibly explain this in a way to say that David HaMelech didn't sin? So Edwin gives one explanation. So remember here, what do we have? So two components that we need to think about. Component number one is the halachic component. In other words, is there some kind of halachic way we can understand this so that David HaMelech didn't transgress halacha? And the second element is from a hashkafic perspective, right? Even if there is some way to spin this so that David HaMelech didn't violate a halacha, still...
It's morally questionable.
Correct. There's still a hashkafic element to this. So the Gemara and Meforshim, many of the Rishonim, explain it as follows, based on what it seems. Even Achitofel was the one who instituted the following practice: that before the Jewish soldiers would go to war, they would give their wives a get. Right? They would give their wives a get. Now there happens to be a machlokes as to whether they would give them a full get, meaning you're divorced as of right now, and if I come back, we'll get remarried. Or,
if she'll have you.
Or was it a conditional get?
If I don't come back,
Was
in a
it?
year.
In other words, if I don't come back, then the get is retroactively valid from the time that I gave it to you.
You have a problem with
But
that.
if I do come back, then
Then
we
that
don't
was
have to
a
get
fact.
remarried.
But you have a problem with that, because based on our Gemara, if she was divorced and had relations with another man, no, that's not a problem.
But she's divorced. Why? How
No,
could
if
have
she
relations?
wasn't divorced,
And then she's furloughed.
if she wasn't divorced, then it's a problem.
No.
No, so the Mefarshim look at both of these approaches to try to explain how Bathsheba was divorced from Uriah at the time that David had relations with
But
her.
he was a chiti. He wasn't.
Wait a
Jew,
second. Hold on a second.
Yeah,
Hold on.
exactly.
Okay.
And it was
Right?
still against her
Right.
will.
Yeah.
That David.
And
That
then David
David.
HaMelech sent her ex-husband back to her.
Hold on a second. Right.
Okay.
Right.
What
So
was he covering up?
It's like
I mean,
Italian
you have
opera.
relations
It's like
with
Italian
another
opera.
woman.
It's like Italian opera.
So
Okay.
the idea is, remember, everything can be interpreted on a multitude of levels. You can look at the story and you can interpret the story and you can say, this is yet another example where the Torah doesn't hesitate to tell us about the transgressions of great people.
Yeah.
Right? The Torah doesn't hesitate. Right? And we have plenty of examples of that. Torah doesn't hesitate. Okay? I mean, maybe they're not as odious in our eyes as this particular behavior might be, but the Torah tells us about Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe Rabbeinu didn't get to go into Eretz Yisrael because he didn't do the right thing. Right? We learn about our leaders who fell short of, and so you could say perhaps there's certainly on one level you can say this is the story of David HaMelech. The story of David HaMelech is someone who succumbed to his lustful temptations, and he wasn't able to resist. Right? He wasn't able to withstand the challenge that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave him, and he succumbed. And he did tshuva, right? He did tshuva. So why the whole thing? So why does the Torah have to tell? Why does Tanakh have to tell us that David HaMelech succumbed to his temptation? It has to tell us that in order to teach us the power of tshuva, that even when you do something as bad as this, you can still do tshuva. Meaning, some people have the idea that I did something so terrible that I can never recover, right? I can't get back from it. And the Torah, perhaps Tanakh is teaching us that, using this example of David HaMelech, that look, you see, the king, right? The king who had multiple wives. In fact, even according to one interpretation, his lust was so powerful that he had relations with his wives that day in order to try to quench the desire, and he was unable to do that, right? He was unable to do that, but so even somebody like this, right? Even somebody like this is able to do tshuva and is able to come back and to come back into the fold, so to speak. That doesn't mean he wasn't punished. There was a punishment, right? This baby died, right? There was a punishment.
But he was rewarded too, because he had a male heir, Shlomo HaMelech.
Correct. And not only so interesting, right?
That's the proof of redemption.
Well, no, I mean correct. That's obviously right. That's obviously always a question, right? Right. Obviously, always a question. But there was some idea that David HaMelech suffered. In some way, that punishment suffered in some way as a result of this.
There was a power struggle later on between Shlomo and the other sons too. And I think David Melech lost another son in the power struggle.
Yeah, sure. Adoniah, we learned, right? We learned.
So he did suffer.
Absalom, we learned, right?
He did suffer. Even more.
Right, correct. So David HaMelech did not have an easy life. From the very beginning of his life, he was overlooked by his family, and from the very beginning of his life, he did not have an easy life. And even, Shaul, right? Shaul was chasing after him all the time, right? He did not have an easy time. Be that as it may, right? Yes, that's one level. We can learn the story on that level, and I don't want to suggest that the story doesn't work on that level. It does work on that level, and the Abarbanel, as a prime example of one of the Mefarshim, interprets it on that level. And indeed, David HaMelech did transgress, and this was a serious transgression, right? No, he doesn't pull any punches. This was a serious transgression, and there are others who say the same thing. But the story can also be interpreted on a different level. And the different level says, wait a second, is it really feasible that David HaMelech sinned? Or maybe this was all taught in such a way, maybe technically he didn't sin, right? And even hashkafically he didn't sin. But it has the appearance of sin to teach us that a person can do tshuva. So this idea that halachically he didn't sin is based on either the idea that there was a get, right? That there was a get in there. What?
So that's only one issue.
Right. No. So
if it's against her will, that's another issue.
No. Correct. Right. So
6 is another.
What?
The 6-year-old girl. I'm not.
No. So if you take all of them and put them all together, you can't possibly explain anything, right? But the idea here is that at least according to one opinion, which is brought down in the Gemara, that there was a get that was given, that Uriah had given her a get. So the Eshes Ish component was removed from the picture. Whether it was a complete get, whether it was a conditional get, that's removed from the picture. And there's another opinion which is brought down that says that Uriah was indeed a Chiti. Right? What's a Chiti? A Hittite. That he wasn't Jewish. Most say that he converted, right? Others say that he didn't convert. In fact, who was Uriah? Do you know who Uriah was before the story of David HaMelech? Before the story of Bathsheba, who was Uriah?
He was the shield carrier for Goliath.
Correct. He was good, Mike. He was the armor bearer.
Rabbi Reisman.
He was the armor bearer of Goliath. And what's the connection between David and Uriah? So after David killed Goliath, David wanted to behead him. Right? He wanted to chop off his head. Okay? But he couldn't. Why not? Because Goliath was wearing this helmet that locked into place. And he couldn't, it was there to protect his neck. And David could, so Uriah offered to help David. And Uriah said, on the condition that I get to marry a Jewish woman. Right? That was Uriah's deal with David HaMelech. And David, right? And David agreed. Right? David agreed. And in effect, the Medrash says, a fascinating idea. The Medrash says, it's almost like David, David, you're so willing to give away Jewish women to non-Jews, right? The woman who was destined for you is going to be given dafka to this person. What does it mean the woman who is destined to you is going to be given to this person? The Zohar says that Bathsheba was David's zivug, right? That Bathsheba was David's zivug. The zivug is the divinely ordained shidduch, right? That Bathsheba was supposed to marry David HaMelech. The Bashert, right? The Bashert for David HaMelech. And fascinating, the Zohar says, just because you're somebody's Bashert doesn't mean you don't marry somebody else. In other words, you can be someone else's Bashert and you can marry someone else. Right, but ultimately the idea is that maybe sometimes you'll never marry your bashert, right? But that a person who doesn't marry a bashert originally might subsequently marry a bashert. Okay, so according to the Zohar, Bathsheba was David's bashert, and it was from the union between Bathsheba and David that Shlomo HaMelech was destined to come, and ultimately, right? Ultimately, the Mashiach, right? The lineage of Mashiach was to be put into place. This was part of the Kadosh Baruch Hu's divine plan. So, even from a hashkafic perspective, it could be that David and Bathsheba both knew that. In other words, David and Bathsheba both knew that they were destined for each other. Right?
Why did she resist?
According to the Zohar.
Because we always knew.
Right, no, but listen, you could always put there's always the objections. If there were no objections, right? In other words, if I could explain this story away, right, very easily, so then there would be everybody would say, oh, it's clear, of course, right? The Gemara wouldn't have to say that whoever said that David HaMelech sinned is a sinner, right? Because it would be clear that that makes perfect sense, but it doesn't make perfect sense. The whole thing is problematic. Okay, so what we have here is this idea that perhaps she was divorced, perhaps Uriah wasn't Jewish, and as a result of that, she had gone to the mikvah, so to speak. So she was muteres to David, and from a hashkafic perspective, even. It's possible that they were the zivug of each other, and that this was put into place by a Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? That ultimately this union was destined to come. Maybe David Beruach HaKodesh knew that, whatever. But it is possible. It is possible to at least see other layers to this story, right? Other layers to the story. And one has to imagine that in different generations, it gets interpreted in different ways, right? In our generation, we're sort of like listening to this and saying, I don't know, it doesn't, right? I don't know. I don't think you'd get off if you were in court. I don't think you get off with these, with these excuses, But on the other hand, from the Gemara's perspective, which is dealing with halacha, hashkafa, maybe there is what to say to try to paint this in a little bit of a different light. Obviously, the question is, why did if you can paint it in a different light, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu paint it in this light? Right? In other words, why did HaKadosh Baruch Hu cause these things to happen? So we have answers for that. HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused it to happen because he wanted to teach David HaMelech that David was not going to be able to resist the temptation. HaKadosh Baruch Hu caused it to happen because he wanted to teach that it is possible to do tshuva even when you do something as odious as this. There are possible explanations for why HaKadosh Baruch Hu incorporated this in. But the bottom line, our Gemara makes reference to this, and our Gemara says, if Achitophel, right? Remember, Achitophel was the one who was the grandfather of Bathsheba. Achitophel was the one who instituted the idea of this divorce, either a full divorce or a conditional divorce when you go into the battle. So if Achitophel had interpreted this correctly, lo radfu basar David, what would they not have done? Right? They wouldn't have pursued David. Dichsiv, as the pasuk says, Lemor Elokim Azavo. Right? So if you look over to the Torah or Hashalem, the very last, not the very last, source number Zion, Lemor Elokim Azavo, Ridfu Visivsuhu, Ki Ein Matzil. Kadosh Baruch Hu has abandoned him, go and chase after him because there's nobody to save him. Right? This was the perspective that Achitophel was using regarding David HaMelech. Had they understood that, listen, even if David HaMelech had sinned, he had Torah. He had the benefit of Torah. He had all the schar from all of that Torah study, and all the schar from all of that Torah study would not be lost. That's why we say, Aveira mechabe mitzvah, but Aveira eina mechabe Torah. That if Achitophel had understood that davar acher, that other interpretation of the pasuk, if Achitophel had understood that, so he never would have joined up with Avshalom. He never would have pursued after David HaMelech. What would have happened would not have happened. That's the introduction that our Gemara brings to it. Okay. And v'heinein an Yodin, the enemies of David didn't know she'avera mechabe mitzvah v'ein avera mechabe Torah. Now the end of the pasuk, the end of this pasuk says as follows: My boz yavozu lo. This is pasuk. If you look at pasuk ches, this is pasuk vav. This is from Shir Hashirim. This is the interpretation of Aveira Mechaba Mitzvah, Ve'ein Aveira Mechaba Torah, is based on an interpretation of this pasuk Vav, that you see in the Torah or Shalem from Shir Hashirim. Mayim Rabim Lo Yuchlu Lechabos Es Ahava, right? That much water is not able to extinguish the power of love. Unaharos Lo Yishtefuha, and a river won't sweep it away. Im yitain ish es kol hon beiso bi'ahava boz yavozu. Right, that if a person tries to acquire love with all of the wealth of his house, boz yavozu, will be despised. So what is this referring to? What is this boz yavozu lo? So Amar Ula. So Ula says, what? Good old Ula. Amar Ula. Lo kishimon ache Azariah, v'lo ki Rabbi Yochanan de Bei Nisia, ella ki Hillel v'shavna. Okay, what is the Gemara talking about? Right? What is the Gemara? What does this mean? What are all of these things? So who is Shimon, the brother of Azariah? And what's the relationship between Rabbi Yochanan and de Bei Nisia? So if you look in the note, look at 44, okay? Shimon is a Tana mentioned in the first mission of Zvachim. He was known as the brother of Azariah because his brother Azariah supported him to make it possible for Shimon to devote himself entirely to the study of Torah. In return, Shimon agreed to share his reward for that study with Azariah. What is that called? That is called a Yisachar Zvulun relationship, right? They had a deal. They went into this with a deal. The deal was, I'll learn, you support me, and we'll share the reward. That was the deal. When the deal was made from the beginning, then it's a good deal. That was the deal of Shimon and the brother Shimon and Azariah, right? And the pasuk is not referring to a situation of Rabbi Yochanan de Bei Nisia. Note number 45. Rabbi Yochanan has similar arrangement with the Nasi to enable him to study Torah. Okay? So we have that same idea, right? That if you make this arrangement in advance, what happens? You make the arrangement in advance, it's considered a good arrangement. It's the Yisachar Zvulun partnership. Ella, but what does it mean when you say, what does the pasuk in Shir Hashirim mean when it says, if you tried to buy love with all the wealth of your house, you're going to be despised? Ella kihillel v'shavna. Who was Hillel and Shavna? So if you look in the note, right, what was it? Right? Shavna, the Chiasa Rav Dimi Amar, when Rav Dimi came, he explained, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he explained and he said, Hillel v'Shavna achehav. Hillel and Shavna were brothers. Did you know Hillel had a brother, right? Shavna. Hillel asak b'Torah. What was Hillel doing? Hillel was studying Torah. Shavna avet iska. What was Shavna doing? He was working, he was a businessman. Shavna spent his whole life being a businessman. Hillel spent his whole life learning Torah, often in abject poverty. What happened? Livasov, after many years, Amar Le, so Shavna said to Hillel, Ta na'arov v'liflog. Listen, you know what? Let's now enter into a deal. Right? I'll pay for
Everything you did.
I'll pay for everything that you did, and you give me half the schar of everything that you did. So what do we say? Yotzasa baskol. A baskol came out from Shamayim va'amra and said, Im yitain ish es kol hon beso, that if a person tries to buy love, meaning tries to buy Torah with all the wealth of his house, boz yavozu, what's going to happen? He's going to be scorned, right? So the idea is that yes, wealth can acquire Torah, but wealth can only acquire Torah if it is accumulated in the service of Torah. In other words, there's a deal. I know when I'm working, I know that part of what I'm earning is helping you learn. And you know when you're learning that part of the reason that you're able to learn is because I'm supporting you. That means that you acquire a chelek in my Torah. That's the deal. That's how it's arranged. But what were Hillel and Shavna about? So after Hillel was the great Hillel, Shavna said, "Listen, by the way, right? I want to buy in. Right? I want a timeshare. Right? I want to buy in. I'll give you money. I'll give you money, and retroactively you'll give me a chelek of." That's no good. That you can't do, right? That you can't do, because there you're trying to buy the Torah as opposed to supporting the efforts of someone who is learning Torah. So that's sort of the end of our whole interpretation and our whole drush about mitzvah and Torah. And next week, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, week, right? No, not a siyum. Next week, in Yirtzeh Hashem, we'll move on. We're going to come back to women learning Torah. We're going to be able to come back to that. So Yirtzeh Hashem will do that. All right, everybody, have a great rest of the evening.